Hello, welcome to another CleaveTech tech tip, and today we're discussing braids. Not braids again, I hear you say, but yes, braids. But we're looking at braids in a different way. We're going to look at some of the issues with braids and how they affect the handling and performance of your car. So on the block in front of me, I've got a whole range of braids that I've been using over the past few years of slot racing. I have my favourites and I'll explain why as this video goes on. But we have some Mid-America braid here. We have some Red Fox braid. We have some Prime braid. We have some Big Mama braid from Palmer. We've got some unknown braid here, not quite sure where it came from. It might be some quite old JK braid, but I'm not entirely sure. We then have these three here, which are SCB braid. I think they're from Germany. They've been around a while, but they do so many types of braid. So here we have three different types of their braid. We have ultra soft, we have super soft, and we have super thin. So what's the difference in the braids? Well, let's start with this Mid-America braid here. If you look at closely, you can see the weave of the braid, and you can see the thickness of the copper. So the copper strands have a thickness, and also you've got the tightness of the weave and the number of strands per weave. All of those things affect your braid and how it can perform on your slot car. Now these Mid-America braids are relatively springy and they're quite stiff to bend. So they've got quite a spring to them. They spring back, yet they're quite stiff to bend. You can see they're quite a nice tight weave and the copper is reasonably thick stranded. If I compare that to a different braid, so let's have a look at these two braids side by side. So at the bottom is the Mid-America braid, and at the top is some Red Fox braid. You can instantly see the Red Fox braid looks a lot finer. It's a lot smoother and a lot finer. The copper it's woven from is much smaller in diameter in terms of the strands. It's also got more weaves on the Red Fox braid than the Mid-America braid. So there is a slight difference between them. But you can definitely see the Red Fox braid has a much smoother finish than the Mid-America braid. The Red Fox braid is also springy, but doesn't have as much resistance as the Mid-America braid. The Mid-America braid is harder to spring than the Red Fox braid, but they both spring back. The Red Fox braid does sort of hold its shape a bit better than the Mid-America braid. The Mid-America braid does spring back to being straight, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. So that shows you a couple of differences in the braid itself. Let's have a look at the clips on them. Well, the Red Fox braid, the clip's already bent over and has a bend at the end there and is crimped onto the braid. That's quite an important thing. Making sure it's crimped to the braid is really good, because if you want to pull your braids out in a hurry in a race and you go to pull the braid and it comes out of the clip and you're left with a clip in your guide, that's an absolute pain in the neck to get out. So making sure the braid is securely attached to your clip is really good. Now on a Mid-America braid, that's not the case. It is just crimped in. I've not had one fall out, but maybe it might be worth crimping it in a little bit tighter and making sure that it's really held in before you bend your clip over on your Mid-America braid.
Meanwhile,
so if your braids are just held into the clip by folding the clip over, you might want to make sure they're more securely fitted into the clip. So to do this, I take a screwdriver. This is just a screwdriver bit that's got a relatively small end to it. And I take a hammer, which in my case is my big pair of pliers. I can put my screwdriver bit over the clip and I give it a tap. And I do that in a couple of places, like that. And then that's crimped them in a lot tighter, so that braid is not going anywhere out of that clip. There we go. There's a close-up showing you that braid is now held in really nicely and securely into that clip. Also, on the Red Fox braid with this extra bend here, when you push it into the guide, it means that it retains some thickness to the clip to make sure it's a nice tight fit in the guide. That, when you do the Mid-America, it's down to you to set up the clip as you want it. So now just have a look at these two braids here. So again, I've got the Mid-America braid on the bottom and the SCB Super Softs at the top. You see they've got the same number of weaves across the braid, but then when I turn it like this, you can see that the Super Soft is a thinner braid than the Mid-America braid. Mid-America braid has a larger thickness to it. Also, as we know, the Mid-America braid is quite springy. This Super Soft, it just bends. It's much softer and it just sort of bends and stays bent, whereas the Mid-America does spring back a bit better, whereas this stuff just bends really easily, but the Mid-America braid doesn't bend anywhere near as easily. So how does this all affect the performance of your slot car? Well, let's put some braid in a guide and I'll show you. So let's slide that in. I've not done really anything with this braid or this clip yet, but I'm going to stick it in this Mid-America guide here. So I'm going to slide it in and then I'm going to fold the braid over. Now remember, when you're folding your braids over, don't fold them really tight at the front. Fold them so that there's a little bit of a gap there at the front, like that. Flatten them down with your thumb as best you can by wiggling them side to side, and then you can push at the front and then they sit nice and flat onto your guide. So let's just say your braids are sitting there in your guide in your car. Now this SCB braid that I put in here, this super soft braid, it is very soft. And the problem with this may be that in an accident, it could spring, you could hit the fence, you've got the momentum of the braid as it hits the fence, and the braids can get all messed up because they're not very rigid. Yet they will move very easily. Yeah, they're easy to change shape, they flex around a lot. So they don't hold their shape particularly well. But they do stay in the weave very well. So the weave is fairly tight and they don't seem to spread apart. They don't seem to all come unwoven, but they are quite soft. Now that can be quite a good thing because the softer the braid, then the less effect it will have when the car's in the slot. So I'll take my block here. If the car's sitting in the slot and you've got a nice soft braid, any sort of springiness on a soft braid won't affect the car anywhere near as much because the mass of the car or the weight of the car pressing down on the braid, obviously the softer the braid it is, then the less effect that braid's going to actually have, you know, if it does get a little bit messed up, because any springiness will be taken out by the weight of the car or the downforce on the car as you're driving round. So that's one good thing for soft braids. But comparing it to a braid that might be quite hard, so a harder, more rigid braid is obviously less likely to get damaged in accidents in the first place. So if you have a crash, it will hold its shape better, it will hold its position better. But it does, obviously a harder braid is going to have more springiness to it. So therefore that's going to hold your car maybe out slot more, or it's going to affect your car more if it's slightly misshapen or slightly out of place. So let's have a look at this unknown braid here. Now this unknown braid, you can see it's got quite a large weave to it. Quite large strands. Looking closely now, it's also quite a thick braid. We'll come to thickness in a minute, but it's also quite a thick braid. It's fairly soft, so therefore it does sort of hold its shape. You know, when you bend it, it stays in shape. It doesn't spring back very well. So it's quite a soft braid. Now, you can already see that on these braids, it's starting to spread apart at the end here and starting to all come unwoven. And that's a problem with this braid, is it's not a very tight weave and it does sort of all come apart. Now, that's quite nice because as it comes apart, it will make better pickup on the end because it will meet with the braids on your track or the tape on your track. It will make a better contact and take up any small gaps there is in the contact area. But if it comes apart too much and spreads out, it can again ride up the side of the slot and it can affect the handling of your car. So this braid here, I don't tend to use it very often now at all because it's quite thick, it is quite soft, so it does sort of stay bent very easily. So if you have an accident, they tend to mess up quite easily, and it's very easy to misshape the braid. And also, it tends to spread apart quite a lot. So those are the things that I'm not too keen on in a braid. I like a braid to hold its shape very well. I generally tend to like a thinner braid, but again, it depends on what motor you're using. But we'll come to that again in a minute. And I say I don't like a braid that spreads out and loses its weave too easily. So how does thickness matter of the braid? Well, in order to find that out, I need to go through and I need to prepare all these braids. Now, you might have seen a previous video that I did on preparing braids, where I took my little Allen wrench with an axle in it. It's actually a very short stubby tip, but I'm going to use the round part of the axle. I'm going to use that to flatten out the braid and thin the braid down and squish the braid till it's a more of a consistent thickness all the way along. So I'm going to do that for these braids, and we'll be back in a minute.
A little longer than a few minutes later.
So I've flattened them all down, and let's have a look at some thicknesses. So let's have a look at the Mid-America braid first of all. So Mid-America braid, flattened down, 0.48 millimeters, 19 thou of thickness. Let's compare that to the SCB Super Soft. The SCB Super Soft, that comes out at 0.37 millimeters and only 14.5 thou. So really, really thin, that one. Most of the others come out around about 0.5 millimeter thick. So let's have a look at this one here. This is the Prime Racing braid. Again, quite a nice tight weave to it. It seems to hold its shape quite nicely. It's fairly springy. It's not quite as stiff as the Mid-America, but definitely stiffer than a lot of the other ones that are there. Let's have a look at the thickness of that. Comes out at 19.5 thou, around about 0.5 millimeter thick. Interestingly, the Red Fox braid, which has a really smooth finish to it, that comes out at 0.44 millimeters, 17 thou in thickness. And this stuff, actually, I haven't used it very much. Maybe I should go back and I should maybe do some more testing with it. It seems like quite a nice braid, to be fair. It's got a nice smooth finish. So again, the smoother, the shinier the braid, the less resistance you'll have against the track braid itself. So possibly it's more top speed. It seems to hold its shape quite well. It would need to be fluffed up a little bit at the end to get better contact, but it seems to hold its shape quite well, and it's quite thin. This Unknown braid wasn't very nice trying to flatten that out. It didn't seem to hold its shape very well, and it just sort of all turned out really wide and horrible. And it comes out at 26 thou, or 0.67 millimeters thick. So it's also really, really thick. So why does the thickness of the braid matter? Well, there's a few reasons why that matters. Let's just push that Red Fox braid into the guide here, and I'll fold it over so you can see it in the guide like that. It also, when you're flattening the braid, it also gives you a feel for what the braid is like. Now, I've just very quickly done that in front of the camera, so I haven't done a particularly good job with the front of that braid. But the thickness of the braid matters, because if your car is sitting on the track, the braid is obviously sitting between the guide and the pickup surface of the track, the braid of the track. So the thicker the braid is, the more you move your guide up. That obviously means there's slightly less guide in the slot. And it also means the front of your car is likely to be raised up from the track surface. Now, depending on the handling you're after, you might want to raise the front of the car. As I've mentioned in a previous video about setup of chassis, again I'll put a link on the screen, running the front of your car slightly higher is quite suitable if you're on a really bumpy track where the surface is really bumpy, or you've got a very, very high rubber track where dragging the front of your chassis on the track might cause a lot of drag, slow you down and not be so good round the corners or even down the straights. So you might raise the front of the car up if you're running on a very rubbered track. Also, banked tracks and tracks with sort of, big sort of swoopy curves, etc., you might want to raise the front of your car up slightly to avoid the front digging in round some of those corners. So you can change the ride height of your car by changing your braids. Just by changing the thickness of the braid that you use, you can change the ride height of the front of your car without having to swap any of your washers on your guide at all. Why else might thickness matter? Well, this Red Fox braid here seems to flatten out and become a fairly thin braid. So that means your ride height at the front of your car could get very, very low. But let's take this unknown braid, for example, here that was really, really thick. Well, maybe the thicker braid can conduct more current. Obviously, the thinner the braid, the more resistance it's going to have. The thinner the strands, the less strands you have, the more resistance your braid is going to have. And the more resistance potentially means a slower motor in the long run. So depending on what type of motors you're going to be using, you might want to consider using a thicker braid to handle the current of your motor. Sometimes the braid can get really, really warm after you've raced. Now that's probably a signal of the motor drawing a lot of current. Maybe it could be poor contact on the track and increased resistance. But think about the thickness of your braid and how much current it's going to conduct as well, and how long it's going to last. A thin braid can burn out quite quickly. This super soft braid, I don't suppose that's going to hold out very well on a high current motor. And I know it doesn't because I've tested it. So lower current motors needed for this super soft braid, but you can get away obviously with a thicker, slightly harder braid for a more amp hungry motor. So I've got the prime braid now in my hand, and one of the nice features of this is that the braid itself is actually soldered into the clip. So the braid can't come out. If you pulled it really hard out of your guide, the braid won't come out of the clip. That's something you could possibly do yourself, but you're going to have to be very, very careful you don't let the solder wick down the braid, because it will very, very quickly, and then you'll end up with your braid being far too stiff, and it'd be pretty useless really. You've ruined your braid. So you've got to be very careful if you're going to do that by hand. So what are the things I'm looking for in a braid? Well, things to look out for, like I said, is how is the braid fixed into the clip? Is it fixed in secure enough? Is it going to come out? If it isn't, then you'll have to either crimp it harder or solder it in, etc. So that's something to look out for. Look out for the thickness of the braid itself, individual strands of braid. Now this is prime braid. This is somewhere in between the thinnest I've found and the thickest I've found. But it has a very nice weave to it. It has quite a nice tight weave, so it holds its shape quite nicely. It doesn't fall apart. It's got some spring, but not too much spring. So for the type of racing that I do with Group 12s or Eurosport racing, it's an ideal sort of braid. Those kind of motors might draw something like 6 to 8 amps when they're running. Probably more, obviously, from a standing start, but on a power supply they draw 6 to 8 amps, which is a reasonable amount. But this braid seems to hold up very well to that kind of current conduction quite well. I also like the fact that this braid does hold its shape well in an accident. It's easy to flatten. It's of a medium thickness. Let's have a look at what thickness this comes out at. So this prime braid is, say, 0.5 millimeter thick. When you flattened it out, works out at 19, nearly 20 thou thick. So it's a good compromise in between the thinnest and the thickest braid. So it's a good starting point. Sometimes if you need to drop the front of the car and you've got no more washers to remove, then you might have to go to a thinner braid to drop the front of the car. But you can always go to a thicker braid to raise the front of the car. These same techniques can apply to racing in plastic car racing or hard body car racing. Again, there are different braids available for that. You can then change your braids in your car to adjust the front ride height, like I've shown you with this chassis here, this JK chassis here. But you can do the same, say, with hard body racing as well. Even if you have to run on the front wheels, changing the way the braids sit in your guide, changing the amount of guide that there is in the slot, can also affect the handling of your car. Well, I know I've rambled on about this, and I said I'd tell you my favourites. Well, I'm not going to tell you what my favourite braid is. You'll have to keep watching. You'll have to maybe watch out for my playlist on CleaveTech reviews, and then you'll find out which one is my favourite braid. I've been filming lots of little reviews of products, and they should be released on a new playlist coming very soon. So thank you for watching again. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. There'll be a big C appearing on the screen here. Check out my other videos as well. Hope you like them. Let me know what you think. Let me know what your favourite braids are. But for now, bye-bye.